Well, as we've been talking all week, it's been a bit of a heavy week, and so here on Sunday, we're going to lighten things up a little bit with Pierre Poilievre. That's right, Pierre has also been traveling this week, and I want to ask you something, Canada. Since when did telling the truth about your country become hating your country? Because according to the liberal activist machine on social media right now, that's apparently the new rule. You say something that could be improved about your country, and you now are the hater of Canada. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre goes on an English podcast while visiting the United Kingdom and talks about Canada's economic struggles, housing crisis, and declining productivity. And suddenly, the internet explodes with accusations that he's a Canada hater. Think about how insane that actually is for a moment. This is an insane political base now. It's a cult. Because by that logic, every Canadian who complains about their rent, every Canadian who talks about food prices, every Canadian who worried about crime, healthcare, or wait times, or even taxes, well then you're all Canada haters, according to Laura Babcock and her Liberal tribe. What nonsense is this? This is, again, listen to me. This is nonsense. Because the truth is the exact opposite. The only way to fix a country's problems is to admit those problems exist in the first place. And in a fascinating moment, during his UK visit, Pierre Poilievre did something that actually reminded us where Canada's political values came from in the first place. He actually visited a quiet meadow along the Thames River called Runnymede. And that visit says a lot more about loving Canada than the critics want to admit. Let's tap into the truth.
Welcome to Bakes on Things.
Hear through the Old English and ancient disputes and see the familiar and cherished rights that we take for granted today. No arrest without charge, trial without jury, confiscation without compensation, and my favorite, one the Americans think they invented but started right here in these fields, no taxation without representation. A ban on the aristocracy stealing firewood from landowners is one of the earliest examples of what we now call property rights. And what is most interesting is that the document barely asks the king to do anything at all or give anything to the barons. It asks him to stop doing harm, and mostly just leave people alone. It imposed restraints on the power of the crown. And this
There you saw it. Brilliantly executed. And if you stood at Runnymede today, it wouldn't look like a place that changed the course of history, in particular the history in Canada. It's just a green field beside the Thames. But of course, as we learned in 1215, the field became one of the most important locations in Western civilization, when King John of England was forced by rebellious barons to sign the Magna Carta. For the first time in history, a king was told something revolutionary. You are not above the law yourself. The Magna Carta declared that even the monarch must obey the law of the land, and that free men could not be imprisoned or punished without lawful judgment. In other words, government power has its limits. Mark's not going to like this one, but it's the truth, and those limits exist to protect the people. That principle eventually gave rise to the Parliament of the United Kingdom, the development of constitutional government, and eventually the entire Westminster system that Canada still operates under today. So when Pierre Poilievre stood there and talked about liberty under law, he wasn't romanticizing his history or the history of Canada or history in general. He was acknowledging the origins of Canada's political DNA. That's exactly what he was doing. But of course, according to the liberal crazy base, he hates Canada. This is something modern politics often ignores, though. When Canada was founded in Canadian Confederation, the fathers of Confederation didn't try to reinvent the wheel in any way. Instead, they intentionally copied the British system. They did this all on purpose because it was working. Responsible government, parliamentary democracy, rule of law, including rule of law that the leaders of the government must abide by. There was a constitutional monarchy, I get that. All of it came directly from Britain. Nobody's denying that. One of the founders of the Liberal Party itself, George Brown, once described Britain as the noblest and best government land on earth. And that admiration helped inspire Canada's creation as a country. So here's the irony I want you all to see here. The same people today that are screaming that Pierre Poilievre is somehow anti-Canadian for talking about Canada's problems are completely ignoring the fact that Canadian political culture itself was built on British traditions of debate, criticism, and accountability for government. Those traditions, well, they go back centuries, not just days, weeks, months, or years. In fact, the idea that criticizing your government is somehow unpatriotic is fundamentally asinine and completely incompatible with the entire tradition Canada inherited from Britain itself. The British political system has always thrived on fierce debate. Prime ministers get shredded weekly in Parliament, all the time, well before Canada was even created. Opposition parties relentlessly challenge those who are in power because it is their job to do so. Journalists tear apart policy failures in most countries, not necessarily here when they're all liberal. That culture of criticism, though, is not a weakness. It's a safeguard against powerful rule that shouldn't be there. Because the moment citizens become afraid to criticize their country's problems is the moment democracy absolutely falls apart. And ironically, the very principle that Poilievre referenced at Runnymede, the idea that rulers must be accountable to the law, exists precisely so governments cannot silence your criticism, because your criticism builds a free and prosperous country. What's even more interesting is that the United States shares these exact same origins. When the American colonies revolted against Britain in the American Revolution, they didn't reject British liberty in any way, really, actually. They argued Britain had violated it themselves. The colonists believed their rights as Englishmen, rights rooted in the Magna Carta, had actually been denied at the time through taxation without representation. In other words, the American Revolution wasn't about abandoning British constitutional principles at all. It was in fact about preserving them even tighter than they were actually preserving them at the time. That's why both Canada and the United States still share many of the same foundational ideas about law, liberty, and governance. They came from the same place. They came from the same ideas. And this is why, truly, this is something we have to consider when we have people saying, you can't criticize your country. So, if all of this history is true, why are Poilievre's critics so angry? Because admitting Canada has serious problems at the hands of the Liberal government in over a decade undermines the political narrative they are currently relying on for power. For years, Canadians have been told a comforting story. Canada's already perfect. There's nothing we could change. Canada is morally superior under a Liberal government. Canada is a global model. Well, we're not anymore. We're seeing it this week. And reality has begun to really crack that illusion, despite what your polls say. Housing prices are exploding. Productivity is collapsing under this government. Healthcare wait times are growing. Food banks, we talk about it all the time. Overworked, overwhelmed, the lines are around the corner, and young Canadians increasingly do not think they have a future in this country and are flocking south for jobs. They think they're going to be worse off than their parents were if they stay here. Talking about those problems does not make someone a Canadian hater. It makes them a realist and someone who wants to attack the problems as they come up firsthand. So here is the absolute truth. You do not fix a house by pretending the roof isn't leaking. When your roof is leaking, when your tub's about to fall through the floor, what do? You confront the problem, you admit there's a problem, and you fix it. You don't fix an economy by pretending wages aren't falling behind. And you don't fix a country by pretending everything is fine when millions of Canadians are struggling. There is no denying that. Real patriotism is not blind loyalty to Mark Carney or the Liberal government. It's commitment to improvement as a country. The Magna Carta didn't happen because everyone told the king he was so good at what he was doing and he was doing a great job. It actually happened because people demanded accountability from the king. That's why it happened, and that's where the change came in. So when Pierre Poilievre stood at Runnymede and made that video and talked about liberty under law, he wasn't attacking Canada in any way. When he appeared on the podcasts, he's not attacking Canada. He was reminding us where Canada came from. He was pointing out today's problems. And again, we came from a tradition of where rulers were held accountable. A tradition where citizens speak freely about the problems in their own country. A tradition where problems are confronted and not hidden. And that tradition began over 800 years ago beside a river in England. And it eventually helped create the country that we now call and enjoy as the country of Canada. So no, telling the truth about Canada's problem isn't anti-Canadian, despite what the users and all the crazy liberals online want you to believe. In fact, it's very patriotic to question what's going on. And if we forget that, then we've forgotten the principles that built this country in the first place. That's how you tap into the truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, join the conversation down below. Let's have this. Did you take offense to Pierre Poilievre calling out our problems on an English podcast? I don't think you did. And you know why? Because you're not a lunatic. But here's the thing. Lunatics, when they get to the level they're at, just can't see the forest for the trees any longer. And that's what we're seeing out there. Let's have a conversation about that in the comments. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. for the Monday episode of Tap the Maple. We will see you then. Enjoy the rest of your week.